Since the recent federal election, we've been trying to have conversations online about how we can go about de radicalizing some people, as well as how we can go about making sure that we show empathy to people, regardless of who they are, regardless of their upbringing, and making sure that we as individuals are being allies in the best way possible. I've obviously struggled with this, as many of my audience might be aware, but that's why I reached out to an expert, and we're really fortunate that at UBC we have a professor, Terri Givens, who studied not just the far right in Europe as well as around the world, but also wrote a book on radical empathy, which is a concept that I was trying to get across. So I am really, really excited to have Terri here for the conversation. If you'd like to give a brief introduction.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. I do want to mention that I grew up in Spokane, Washington, because that's a big part of what I talk about in my book. As a Black woman growing up in a place that was less than 1% Black, that really had an impact on me. And also, I currently split my time between Vancouver and the US. I'm currently in California because most of my family lives down below the southern border. And I am also, very active in my community. I do a lot of work with different organizations, and so I'm very much a community oriented person, and try to use my research not only for writing academic articles, but also to help the people understand the world.
So before I touch up, because we talked a bit about what we wanted to discuss, but before that, because something just came to mind, because you did study the far right, and now you have been
Mhm.
writing about unity, empathy, how we can work together and kind of bridge these gaps. How do you find that your research and your education and studies in the far right has allowed you to have a different lens upon empathy and dealing with these difficult political times that we're in?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, years ago, I was pointing out that there was these issues with inequality, right? And unfortunately, they were being weaponized by the far right in a way that was targeting people, excuse me, who were being hurt by that inequality, and basically allowing them to scapegoat people who maybe weren't really responsible for their economic situation, and that we needed to take seriously the concerns of people who weren't doing well in the current economy. And I think it's hard sometimes for people to understand that the far right was really doing a good job of tapping into some issues like immigration, like race, like education and so on in ways that resonated with people, and that we weren't doing enough to highlight how we could be more helpful to those people in understanding, but also trying to remedy some of the ways that the economic situation, as well as uh, their attitudes were impacting themselves.
And we might touch upon that a bit more later, but I think one of the things that many people in my audience might be concerned about is um, accidentally validating or otherwise seeming like they are approving of somebody's hateful rhetoric or otherwise negative actions and behaviors. But also, there's that difficult piece where it's like, yeah, how do we move people from point A to point B? And so the way that I had framed it was like, we need to show empathy to young white men to prevent them from falling down the alt right pipeline. And a lot of people were upset with that because it implied that I was asking women or specifically minorities to take on the labor
Mhm.
that was the responsibility of white men in particular. And I hadn't seen that because I come from it from the lens of a teacher. And so, like, my education as a teacher was like making sure that we're always providing safe and vulnerable opportunities for our students to open up and feel safe with us. So I'm always vulnerable with my students. And so I'm struggling with that in so much that it's different when I'm in the classroom with a bunch of 16-year-old boys and I can talk to them and I can kind of bring them towards the center. But when we have these conversations, whether it's online or in person in public, it becomes a whole different ball game. So, do you have any advice for how we can kind of navigate this in a way where we are bringing people in without seemingly validating their hate while still understanding where they're coming from?
Well, I think, the first thing I always say is that empathy is not absolution. So look, there's going to be not the problem is we see ourselves as, okay, I'm an individual and I don't like what this person is doing, or I disagree with this scenario. But the reality is, I always say we need to start with ourselves, right? And we need to understand, why am I reacting this way? We need to understand, so I would take a step back and say, I always say, before we can help others, we have to help ourselves. And
Put on your
the
own life air mask type thing, right? Like,
exactly,
yeah.
because part of the problem I see is we're so ready to jump on people on social media, and I see that all the time, right? It's in a sense, the algorithms and everything are designed to get us, for outrage. And I think for me, part of the reason I wrote this book, and I started thinking about it long before I got very much involved in social media, was that I realized that I had to, especially understanding the way that I was raised and how my parents had bias, right? And that, I often had, struggles with reaching out to people, even other Black people, because of the way I was raised, right? And so, I always say that, take that step back and understand where you're coming from. And I really try to take that few seconds. I see something and I want to respond. So I was like, why am I, where is this anger coming from? Why am I responding this way? And understanding myself has made it so much easier for me to be more open. I'm not saying you have to like and, you know, say, oh, you're okay, pat somebody on the head. No, it's that I need to be able to understand myself, to understand the experiences of others, and be open to the experiences of others, whether it's, the white guy over here understanding my experience as being different, um because I was raised in Spokane, Washington, and not in, someplace in the South or something like that. Because the problem is, we look at people and we say, and this is normal, right? Your brain wants to categorize people and put people in boxes. And so, and my biggest frustration in life is often is that people want to put me into a box because they see a Black woman in front of them, and it's like, oh well, well, Terry's Black, so she must study politics and race, which I sort of do. But I mean, I started off, studying Europe. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have said, well, why do you study Europe? Well, you're making assumptions based on, this, not
Because you're Black, you must obviously have to study American fascism, and you can't possibly be interested in what occurs in France and Germany.
exactly. And I speak French and German, you know, and so, there's that aspect of it. And, anyway, so my point being that, we tend to have a lack of understanding of ourselves, and oftentimes, vulnerability is important with ourselves. I was just talking about this with somebody, that people, because I have the 6 steps to radical empathy, and the first is vulnerability, and you were talking about being vulnerable with your students, but realistically, it's being vulnerable with yourself that is most important, right?
And do you
And
mean like
then,
honesty with vulnerability? Like, is that like
yes.
being, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, basically, me saying that, okay, I need to take a look at how I was raised, to understand my parents, to understand their history, to understand what they lived through, so that, and how that then influenced the way they raised me. To understand my sibling. I'm the youngest of 7. All my siblings have had an influence on my life. To understand my own hometown of Spokane, Washington, to understand that history, that, basically the Pacific Northwest was restricted for Black people, which is why there aren't very many Black people there now. So all of these things help me understand, who I am, and being accepting. And I think, part of the problem for a lot of us is being willing to accept who we are, and then to work to change, because change is the hardest part of all of this.
So, and I appreciate that. That's helpful. You mentioned your book, and I was lucky enough that you were able to give me copies of both your books to read. Do you want to take a moment to highlight the two books that you wrote? Specifically, I think what's interesting to me is that you wrote the first one at the tail end of the Trump presidency one, the second book at the
Hmm.
tail end of Biden and in the introduction of Trump two. And so I noticed not necessarily a tone shift in the two books, but definitely a more thorough understanding of like, hey, it's not just about like the academic side of this and understanding a concept, but like the second book really seemed to focus on like, yeah, that relationship building and like really like how do we as a society move forward?
Right. So the first book, Radical Empathy, is really was a memoir in many ways. Like it's me talking about, my dad passing away from heart disease because our systems, um, don't address underlying issues of that black men. I mean, black men are more likely to die of a first heart attack just because they're black men. You
Well, and
know,
you were really
the
vulnerable about your family situation too with your mother and all that kind of stuff. And
yes.
so like you really did lead by example in your book.
Yes, so that book really, I feel like even though each chapter ends with here's some things you can do, whenever I go talk about it, people are like, okay, so how do we, what do I do? How do I create change? So I decided to do the second book, in order to really, like give clear examples of how, starting with individuals, then going on to organizations, and then governments, and then internationally, and in many ways, I was highlighting the ways I've been involved in change, but also highlighting how other people have been involved in change. And then again, each chapter ends with ways that you can actually, try to do this. And the most important part of it is practicing empathy. It's something we have to practice every day. I mean, I can tell you, it's been really a challenge the last few weeks, to practice empathy as I watch, the United States falling apart. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah,
Something.
so these two, yeah, so the first book was really more memoir. The second book is more, here's ways you can actually get out there and do the work.
And I think that's kind of needed right now. Simply because we're at a point in society where I think there's a lot of people who either think there's nothing that can be done, or they're in a
Hmm.
place of emotional turmoil where they don't want to interact with people on the other side of the political aisle, or people who they deem as dangerous and harmful, and that's to protect their own peace and their own sanity. And so then I think it falls to people like me and people who are in positions of privilege, or are willing to have those conversations and to try to make that change. And so
And
having,
actually,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
no,
If
no,
you
go
don't
ahead.
mind, Frank, I'd like to come back to your point that like women and minorities feel like they are the ones who are always asked to do this work, and some of us, will say, are kind of sitting on the sidelines, not only because we are always asked to do the work, but also for our safety. And so, I would never ask somebody to, step up when their personal safety is involved. But that, as you said, that means that other people need to step up and allies need to step up. And the good news is that I see a lot of that happening. Is that when I remember going to the Boston protest back in April, I happened to be on the East Coast, and I went to the one in right near the city hall, and I did, it was just a sea of older white people who had decided, yes, we need to step up and do this work. So I think we have to find some balance here. And what I often argue is that, look, there's different ways to approach this. It's not that, okay, I'm somebody who happens to be out there and doing a lot of this work, writing about it, etc. But I don't expect everybody to do that, and we have to find our own ways, even if it's within your own household or with family members. If in places where you feel like you can do something, and every little thing matters.
Well, and I think that's part of the struggle where it's people, specifically white men, people in my position, who are trying to do every little thing to try to make that change. I think one of the points of friction that I've been coming up across recently is the dichotomy of I need to speak up on behalf of marginalized people and kind of stand in front of them and take that bullet so that their harm is not coming to them. But also, many people keep saying, "Don't speak for my community. Don't speak for us. Don't speak on behalf of us."
Mhm.
And what'll end up happening is then those people start arguing with each other because they say, no, I want him to speak up. No, I don't want him to speak up. No, he can't say this. No, yes, he can't. And then it's, I don't want to become the mediator and start telling people from minority communities, hey, this is the person who I agree with, because that then all of a sudden devolves into not necessarily like team A, team B, like in group, out group behavior, but it is antithetical to the whole point of building community. So, what do we do in those moments where people who are in those minority communities have those diverging opinions, not on the fact that we have to do better, but on how we
Mhm.
do better and what the role is of other people and allies in that group forming and
Well,
coalition building?
exactly. And, I learned a huge lesson on that moving to Canada because, I had not been very much involved in Indigenous reconciliation. Unfortunately, that's not happening much in the US. But when I moved to McGill 4 years ago and was doing work around the strategy to address anti-Black racism, I also connected with the folks doing work around Indigenous reconciliation. And it just opened a whole new world for me that I had not really explored, and began to understand this idea of, basically, people being able to take control of their own narrative. And so I think the most important thing for me in terms of learning that lesson was, I don't need to speak for somebody in order to support them.
Mhm.
What I can do is say it, because I have a little bit of a problem with land acknowledgements because I feel like they're just performative. But I
I
go,
did all, I've done so many videos on that, and that is some maybe something we can talk about in a minute. But I would love to hear you continue on that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, my point just being that I went to the source. I wanted, what are indigenous people saying about land acknowledgements? And then I developed my own that also addresses, immigrant labor, people who have been exploited, and enslavement because slavery happened in Canada. And so for me, it was really important, first of all, to find a way to do the land acknowledgement that was honoring the land I was on, but also acknowledging that a lot of the cities and things that were built in Canada were by, like rail lines and things, by people who were brought in as forced labor, the enslaved, etc. And so, um, basically, my take on it is speak from your own experience unless you've done the work to understand what the groups you're working with um, would like you to do. So it's about listening, it's about learning, and not making assumptions. And the not making assumptions is a huge, huge, huge issue because people get on social media and they see a short blurb and then they make all kinds of assumptions
It's because it's
based
so
on it.
easy to do. It's so it's and we all fall into that
We
trap.
all do it.
It's
We
hard.
all do
Yeah, I
it.
know. So one of the things that you were talking about were that land acknowledgements are performative, and
Mhm.
when I was doing my teacher training, we had an Indigenous educator come in and basically tell us that, like, yeah, like the way that we do land acknowledgements are performative. If you want to do a good one, you don't have to talk about the treaties or the lands. Talk about the beauty of nature. Talk about the Sky Father and being thankful for the day. And if it's raining, be thankful for the rain because the rain grows the crops. And if it's sunny, be thankful for the sun because the sun gives us life energy. And so I've been incorporating that into whenever I had to do land acknowledgements, and I've been sharing that online. But then I'll also have usually white Anglo-Saxon social justice warriors come and tell me, oh, but you have to acknowledge the harm that was done by our colonizing ancestors, and you have to acknowledge that. And so I think that there is a lot of unpacking that has to be done, in so much that people want to be good allies so badly that we make assumptions, we don't listen to what people want, and even though we think we've unpacked and learned what those minority communities want, we don't always necessarily deliver properly on that. So the one thing I kind of wanted to ask you on that is like, so you said you came to Canada, you saw things differently from an Indigenous point of view, and I feel as though for a lot of the times, the vast majority of Canadians want to see positive change when it comes to how we treat Indigenous peoples. They want to see Indigenous people have better opportunities, but at the same time, a lot of Canadians don't want to actually do the work, do the action, and so it ends up being very performative. Uh, is that something that you see happening both in the U.S. and globally, or is like that a very specific thing to Indigenous peoples, whether it's in Canada or like is that something that happens in other communities as well, or is that more of an Indigenous specific issue you find?
Oh no, it's very much a broader issue. I mean, I've spent a lot of time going around the globe, and I am going to call you out on something.
Yeah, yeah, for
Is
sure.
when you say things like white Anglo-Saxon social justice warrior, you're making a judgment
I
call
am
there.
creating a stereotype, and I am
Yes.
creating an image in somebody's mind of the person who is our potential enemy or the person that we are mad at. You are correct.
And the reason I say that is, it's not necessarily, whoever that is. I mean, to me, when I hear that, I'm like, who is that? But, I mean, I would say rather than using that term, we all are, you know, possibly doing those kinds of things, right? I mean, I grew up in Spokane where, and actually, I just wrote a paper where I started off with a land acknowledgement talking about the growing up in Spokane, Washington, and the indigenous people there. And I'd never done that before because it had never occurred to me that I should do that. But I was writing a book about, not a book, an article that tries to dig into these issues, and so it addresses your question in the sense that we're coming back to how things are systematized, right? And so racial capitalism thrives on being able to take. um, and so going back to settler colonialism and taking land um causing harm to indigenous populations and stealing people from Africa, all these different things, right? And so if we don't start to see these things, and this is why I think it's so important for people like me to be studying these things from a global perspective, because if we don't understand how it's systematic, and we have to be able to justify in our minds why we're allowed to live on this land, and not see the reason I think these issues are, the things like land acknowledgement are performative is because we aren't giving back the land. I mean, to be fair, at University of British Columbia, they have, we have the Musqueam lands and so on. And that's, really, I think there is some momentum to that. But gosh, when I see how so little is happening in the US on that front, um, and that globally we are, going backwards in many ways. I mean, the US is going backwards in terms of taking in refugees and things like that. And um, so I think it's really important, and this is why, I teach things the way I do, is that, it's really easy to focus in on race in the US and the history there. And not that it's easy actually, but that, you know, constructing class
Yeah.
around that is not so difficult. But to try and then say, okay, let's look at the systems. Let's understand how colonialism and neocolonialism and decolonization are or aren't happening. And so I think that there's a lack of understanding of the broader systems, but in many ways it's pernicious, and it's what, we don't want our kids to learn this stuff.
And well, so one of the funny things you say, we don't want our kids to learn about this stuff. Empathy has become a dirty word in American politics. Like
Hmm.
there are literally talking heads on Fox News and some Republicans who are saying, like empathy is a dirty word. Elon Musk obviously saying stuff like that, but who cares about his opinion? Uh, but for people who are watching, would it be possible for you to explain very briefly the different types of empathy, including radical empathy? Because we've mentioned it, but I don't think we have defined radical empathy.
Right. So the way I define empathy is that it's being able to not only step into somebody else's shoes, right? um I've had people that, well, this other person's shoes don't fit, how do I step into them? um it's more about looking, being able to step outside of yourself. And this is why, if you so let me just go quickly explain the 6 steps, because I mentioned them briefly. But the first step is willingness to be vulnerable. And that's because if you're willing to be vulnerable and look outside yourself, then you have to be basically grounded in who you are. And so if I am grounded in who I am, if I know who I am, if I'm trying to be a better person, etc., then I'm going to be much more open to, uh, you know, the understanding other people's differences, and so on. And I talk about it even in the context of getting into a relationship. Is that basically, I firmly believe that if you can learn to love yourself, you're way more likely to be able to love somebody else. And so it's about learning that self-compassion, self-love, and then being more open to the experiences of others. And instead of saying, oh, this guy, he didn't show up tonight, let me find out why he didn't show up tonight. Maybe something happened. Maybe there's something behind, what's going on here. And so it's that it's the same thing with jumping to conclusions, right? I mean, you have a tendency to kind of jump to what's the first thing that's coming out in your up in your head. And I think I mentioned to you, my son has ADHD, and he cracks me up all the time because so he's very honest and sometimes brutally honest, and will say things, and I'm like,
It's the
okay.
lack of a filter, right? It's the word, the thoughts happen, so the words have to come out, and that can make things very difficult and very challenging.
Exactly. So I have empathy for him, and I'm open to understanding his ADHD. And it's been a struggle in so many ways. But because I have empathy for my son, and instead of just saying, being mad at him for saying something, I'm like, oh, it's really interesting. Let me think about why he said that, and how, so anyway. But then so there's then the next step is really practicing empathy. So empathy, as I said, is not just stepping into somebody else's shoes. It's really trying to see the world from their perspective. And I grew up Catholic, and I really believe that doing unto others as you would have them do unto you is important. But think has needs another step, where I want to do unto others as they want me to do unto them, right? And that's different. It's not saying, oh, well, I like vanilla ice cream, so I'm going to
I'm
give
gonna
you
give
some
you
vanilla
vanilla.
ice
Yeah.
cream. I'm going to ask you, and asking questions is so important in terms of practicing empathy. Instead of, jumping all over somebody on social media, why don't we say, let me think about why he might have said that, and let me ask some questions. And I always tell people, asking questions is so important. And there are certain questions that get you into trouble, like, I remember being in Mexico. Is where are you from? And I'm like, the U.S. No, where are you from? I'm like, Washington State. And no, no, no. Where are you from? And I'm like, Spokane? I mean, it's like, I'm African American.
And it doesn't it's a really it's really tough when people ask questions like that. Even like, so like my parents are immigrants, for example, right? And but
Right.
I'm white. I grew
Hmm.
up with all of the privileges that come with that, and I didn't realize until my adulthood that there were, in some people's minds, still gradients of white. At one of the schools
Hmm.
that I taught at, I had showed up. Like right now, I'm a little tanned, but when I have like a full vacation in the summer, I get very, very dark. And like a lot of times, people will think that I'm like Lebanese or Middle Eastern or whatever, and that's just because I have olive skin tone because I'm from the deep south, right? My parents are from Sicily. And so I showed up at this new school, and somebody was like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, like I live in Burlington." They're like, "But where are you from?" And I'm like, "From here." They're like, "Well, where'd you grow up?" I'm like, "Well, I grew up in Woodbridge." They're like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense because you look like you grew up in Woodbridge." And I'm like, if you're saying this to me, a colleague that like is for all intents and purposes white, what are you saying to black people? What are you saying to students? What are you saying to students of color? Like
Hmm.
And that's the thing. So I think there's a lot of white people who've never had that experience where like all of a sudden they realize like, oh, is this what I sound like when I say, can I touch your hair? Or where are you from? Or, oh my God, I've never seen something like I think a lot of people never have that moment. And I've had quite a few of those. I had a lot of very, very small town white friends in university who were saying that I was so cultured because I was Italian and stuff like that. And they had never met an Italian person before. That was how
Mhm.
far removed they were from the multiculturalism that I had grown up in. Um,
Right.
so yeah, I just think that that's something that people need to reflect on. Like, uh, it's hard to be put in that position, but once you have been in that position, I think it's a lot easier to empathize and it's a lot easier to practice because now I'm like, yeah, that was really messed up. I can only imagine if this was my everyday lived experience.
Exactly. And anyway, so I really think that you know, yes, ask questions, but take the answer, right? Um, if that woman had stopped when I said I was American, she would have understood, okay, I'm African, she's African American, she probably doesn't know anything about her history, et
She
cetera, although
wanted
I
to
do know
know
some.
specific. She wanted to know specifically, was there a country, was there a place, and that's not an appropriate question because that doesn't matter, right?
Right. Well, actually, I mean, I don't mind that as much as I mind that she wouldn't take my answer.
Fair.
Right. I could have, because a lot of people think I'm from Brazil, or God, I go to Cuba and everybody thinks I'm Cuban. And but there's and it's important to be careful when you're asking questions and accept answers. So, there's the whole practicing empathy, but then there's also, it's radical because the next step is taking action and then finally creating change. And creating change is the hardest part, which is why I wrote a whole nother book on it.
Well, and that's the thing. I think the actionable items are the things that people really struggle with, and so like that actually does lead me into. And I kind of had to write some of this down, and I had talked to you about this, and it's because I want to make sure I get the wording right. So I got my laptop here.
Mhm.
Um, now, so I'll start with the first one because this one's a little bit easier before I get into the questions that are a little meatier. Um, how can we go about breaking down our own internal biases so that we can be better allies to each other? You mentioned that earlier in the interview, where it's about being vulnerable with ourselves.
Mhm.
But I think that we a lot of the times struggle with even identifying what our biases are. So is there a process by which we can go about doing that?
Yeah, I think it's really a process. So first of all, this does not happen overnight. I think part of the problem is we expect people, okay, you read that book, so now you can change. No,
You're an
that's
expert.
not
You
how
got to know
it
your stuff.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a often talk about the concept of cultural humility, um, because there was this whole movement around cultural competence where it's like, okay, I have learned everything there is to know about this culture, and now I am competent to teach and so on in this area. And the reality is it's an ongoing process. And you know I wrote the book about radical empathy, and I'm constantly having to practice empathy. It's never ending. Like I said, moving to Canada was a huge eye-opening experience for me in so many different ways. And but for me, I feel like it was successful, or it's an ongoing, process, but still, I was successful in so it's take a step back and try to figure out um, not only what you need to learn, but also where are some of your deficits. And obviously one of my deficits was in understanding indigenous reconciliation and how those processes had developed, and I'd never really learned. I'd heard about them, but I'd never really learned the horrors of the boarding schools and how that actually happened in the US as well. So it's being willing to learn and going beyond just, oh, there's this one book I need to read. And I remember the summer of 2020, and all these books all of a sudden went on the bestseller list. And unfortunately my book hadn't come out yet. But uh it's fine, read the book. I'm not telling you to not read the book, but also talk to people. Get feedback where you can. I talk a lot about mentors. I have so many mentors, and not just mentors, but peers and friends and family members who have helped me in this process. And you know, the biggest way you can learn is to not be defensive, right?
And that's the hardest thing to hear, because it's like everyone, of course, wants to be like, well, I'm not trying to be defensive, but that in and of itself is defensive. So
Hmm.
it's yeah, I know, I get it. And it is something, as you said, it's a process. It's hard to not default to that.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Maybe a little bit of a quick sidebar, bit of a change of pace and tone, because you mentioned
Hmm.
moving to Canada and learning about different things. So a little Canadian test. Just kind of want to get your thoughts on certain things. If you haven't experienced these things, like whatever, milk in bags.
I've experienced milk in bags.
Was it a problem? Like I see some people, and they look at it and it's like overwhelmingly like disgust or like confusion. Like was it like
No, no, I mean, so as I mentioned, I've traveled the world. I've seen it all. No, I shouldn't say that because I haven't seen it all. But my first instinct when I see like milk in bags, I was like, what the heck is this? And but then I was like, oh, okay, let me try to understand why this makes sense.
different way of
Um,
packaging and distribution and
yeah, and so it wasn't a big deal. Now let's talk poutine.
so that's what I was my so I was gonna say, have you had good poutine? Because you can get poutine at a McDonald's here, and that's not good poutine. Have you had good poutine?
Yeah. Yes, I have had good poutine, and I'm just not into the cheese curds. I'm sorry.
You know what? I was never into like the classic poutine, not because of the cheese, but because of the gravy. Um,
Yeah,
but then there's a chain called Smokes Poutinery, and they basically do like loaded poutines, and like you know what? I'm in. Like the second you
yeah,
start adding a couple extra toppings on there, you've got me. I'm hooked.
yeah. I mean, if you can exchange the gravy for like um smoked pork with some barbecue sauce and I've
That's
had
it.
that kind of poutine before, then I'll even eat the cheese curds.
What about have you had like proper Halifax donair?
No.
So donair is like a gyro or like a shawarma, but the way
Hmm.
that it was kind of popularized in Halifax was with their donair sauce is very sweet. I
Oh,
don't like it.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm really not a fan. Some people love it, but if you ever have a chance, I would say try it, simply because it's one the part of being the Canadian identity, where we have all these other imported foods and we kind of make it our own. And for some reason, most of those things end up being sweet, like Halifax donair. Nanaimo bars. You're in BC. Have you had a Nanaimo bar?
Yeah,
I'm
they're
not. I'm
amazing.
not too big on them. Do you like them?
Yeah. Well,
Here's a
the
controversial one, though.
ingredients,
Yeah,
yeah, the ingredients to me are just, anyway, it's a great combo.
yeah. But so one of the more controversial ones is butter tarts. Some people are either like die hard in favor of butter tarts, whereas me, I'm like,
Yeah, and okay, so I first have to tell you, in the last 15 years or so, I've become gluten intolerant.
ah,
So certain things just don't work for me. And by the way, I do know what we call it dinner kebab in German. And so that's where I really learned about, the sliced meat and all that, in the like a gyro. But of course I can't eat that anymore either because of the gluten. But no, I find that sugary sweet things, there's not very many of them in Canada that I'm like more than some of the things I like in the US. But anyway, yeah.
the only one I would say, if you have a chance to try it, and this might be more of an Ontario Quebec thing. I don't know. Um, I don't know if it's maple is as popular out west, but literally just in the winter they'll have like boiled maple syrup and just pour it on the snow and
Cabana.
roll it on a stick. It's
Yep.
so simple and it makes me happy. I just love that.
Yeah. No, I love that. I lived in Montreal for three
Yeah, so
years
you're
and
familiar,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so let's dive back into some of the more I guess complex questions. As I said, I'd written these out because I wanted to make sure I wasn't kind of miswording these. But many
Sure.
people have expressed their unwillingness, or in some cases, their inability to express empathy towards others who are part of groups that harm them. Specifically, when I raised the concept of society as a whole showing empathy to young white men in the hopes that it helps them off the edge of falling into the alt-right, many felt as though that I was implying that women, and by extension women of color, do the emotional labor that men, and specifically white men, are responsible for. This was something that I personally struggled with. And you had mentioned a quote in one of your books, and you had mentioned it earlier in this interview, that empathy is not absolution. I'd love to get your view on this as it pertains to radical empathy and the rise of the alt right among young men, and then specifically our responsibilities to each other and what we can do to help guide young men away from the alt right.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's not just young white men, it's young men, period. Because my own son almost got dragged down a rabbit hole of, radicalization. And luckily, he pulled himself out and told me about it later. So what we need to understand is that men in general are struggling, young men in particular, and it's not just white, black, brown, whatever. They all are, and I see it in university because most of the universities I have been in are majority female, like 60% female, 40% male. So something is happening along the way. And actually, having raised two sons, where I see it happening is in elementary school. I felt like it was not designed for my sons, especially my son with ADHD, where there's this expectation that you're going to sit for hours. And, they've taken away, a lot of the physical activity that used to happen in school. I mean, I'm very lucky that my younger son, who has ADHD, had amazing teachers in elementary school, and they really watched out for him. They would send him out to the hallway when it was raining and let have him run up and down because recess was canceled.
Got to
They
get that
would,
energy out. Yeah.
yeah, so they would work to get the energy out. But I also watched, like, when my older son was in middle school, and like two-thirds of the boys practically failed a math class, and all the girls were doing great. And I'm like, teachers, don't you see a pattern here? And don't you think you should do something about it? And so about half of those boys ended up leaving and going to a different school. Thank goodness we, did something before he just totally crashed and burned. And he did fine in this other school where they were just much more empathetic towards young men. And then, the whole COVID thing. So there's so many different factors. There's how elementary school is not designed for boys. There's how the whole video game culture is designed. And my friend Cynthia Miller Idris, I think I sent you the link to her, some of her
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
She's really been looking at this from how video games emphasize misogyny and so on. I was talking to my husband about this the other day about how, we had kind of limited our boys in the kinds of games they could have. Like they wanted to play Grand Theft Auto, and I'm like, no, that game's horrible. And as they got older, we would let them do more and more. And, I'm going to knock on wood here when I say, so far so good. They haven't really, gotten in, to the misogynistic, racist side of things. And the problem is we think, oh, they're black boys, they can't be racist. Of course they can be racist. We can all be racist. And we can all be misogynistic. And, I mean, I can tell you, and sorry, this was a sidebar, but when I was a young grad student and working with older women scholars, a lot of time they were like, oh, if you're gonna succeed in this, you have to be like a man. And none of them had kids, and I'm gonna be who I am, I'm gonna have kids, etc. And so oftentimes, even if we are part of a marginalized group, we take on, it's like, well, to be successful, I have to be like them, right?
Yeah.
And instead, my goal has been to change the way we do things, and so that we don't have to, basically cut ourselves off and not be who we are. But I mean, the young men thing is, I think people will be more sympathetic if we think about it as a broader problem, because um, uh, COVID it was just really hard on everybody. But I know for my son who has ADHD, it was just it hit at the exact wrong time, and he still struggles to this day, partly because of that. But I think that if we don't recognize that we all have men in our lives, I assume, one way or another, brothers, husbands, fathers, And that, um just saying, oh, you have power, so we're not going to worry about you, is not helpful. Yes, men have power, and we can see how it's playing out in different spaces.
And it would be more
But
productive if we can kind of empathize with them and bring them in and help them use their power to create positive change, right? Like,
that's
I
right.
think
And
that's where I see from.
yeah, and if we go to examples of men who have created positive change, I mean, I remember meeting the U.S. ambassador to Canada in the previous administration, and he was a leader who had done all kinds of work around DEI and supporting women. And like I said, I have a whole chapter in my book of men mostly who helped support me throughout my career. And so, part of it is, don't lump everybody into one category.
Yeah.
There are people who have you know done things for me that I never thought, being who they are, they would have done that. And my career is what it is today because of people who along the way said, I'm going to help Terry get to that next level.
The next thing that I kind of wanted to touch upon is talking about the role of radical empathy in
Hmm.
restorative justice. Um,
Hmm.
because I think that when people hear the term radical empathy and the description of it, they might jump to a conclusion about how we go about using it in certain contexts. So, in restorative justice, if we want to display radical empathy, does that also mean that the victim of the violence is to show empathy towards the perpetrator, or how exactly do we navigate that?
No, and obviously that's a complex question. It depends, right? And so restorative justice, the whole idea of it is not saying that. I mean, I think people misunderstand the concept in many ways because they think, oh, this means that both sides have to basically be open and empathetic with each other, and that's not the way this worked. I mean, first of all, what was the injury? So tell me what the injury was, and then I can give you a better sense of, excuse me, what restorative justice is. Because so when somebody has been like physically or even emotionally harmed by, I mean, I have been harmed by people, and to me, restorative justice is them understanding what they did and being able to say, I'm sorry for what I did, and me being willing to accept that. But that doesn't mean that I don't still bear the scars, right? And, I guess, my example is my mother who had, I didn't find out until after my father died that she had borderline personality disorder. And frankly, I'm still angry with my mother because of the way she treated us and the harm she caused. But I understand her and I have compassion for what she lived through. And part of writing this book was understanding that my mother was born in 1930, Louisiana, USA. And she lived through Jim Crow. She lived through the Depression. She lived through World War II. Imagine the uncertain. I know we're in an incredibly uncertain time right now, but imagine the uncertainty of living in the 1940s anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it was. Hopefully, things don't get that severe, but like it impacted people, I think that we have to be understanding and in some cases compassionate towards those people who are of different generations and understand. Like, it's the same thing when people are like, oh, all these millennials or all these Gen Z people, and it's like, yeah, but like when you were the young generation, your parents' generation was saying how you guys were the lazy ones and you didn't understand. And so, like, there's a lot of these different conversations where I think if we just take the moment to be compassionate and understand and appreciate people's different
Mm-hmm.
lived experiences, we can really come to a better understanding of why people think the way they do and then bring them to different conclusions or help guide them to a better place.
I read this book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, and that book helped me understand my parents better than almost anything else. And, I wish I had read it before they passed away. But, in the end, it just gave me a whole different perspective on what their lives must have been like. And, the fact that I am the culmination of like their dreams and my grandparents' dreams. My grandparents were sharecroppers in the South. and they moved, my mom moved to the west in Los Angeles. My grandparent father on my dad's side moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and because they wanted a better life for their kids. I could sit here and be all angry about, oh, my mom, she was so mean and blah blah blah. But and then sometimes I do that, but I can also have compassion for her and understand she made sacrifices that allowed me to be Terry Givens, internationally renowned political scientist. And
Where we stand on the shoulders of giants and all that, right? Like,
exactly.
yeah.
Or we
But
stand on the giant. No, no, no. Not that, I think that's an important point to make, is that no, we don't stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of human beings who made sacrifices for
yeah,
us.
not I guess not to create myths and legends out of people, and just to like, acknowledge that like at every point, like the people who fought in World War II were just regular people like you and me. They were just in dire circumstances, and they showed up and they did what they needed to do. And we are in a time now where we need to show up and do what we need to do. Um,
Exactly.
there is one more thing I just quickly wanted to touch on before we wrap up here. You wrote about the importance of allies in working against
Mhm.
oppression. Many times, people who might be aligned on one issue can find another person who is aligned with them on that thing is not aligned with them in another place. So we're allies here, but we have a vehement disagreement over here, and even to the point where that person might be dangerous. It's like almost like maybe we agree on sexuality, but we don't agree on race, right? Those types of
Mhm.
allies. Like not all queer people are also allies to black people, and vice versa, right? And many people also talk about how the left eats itself and how there's purity tests, and who is allowed to be an ally to who. How can we better navigate these issues to ensure that we're working towards the best societal outcomes? And I know that that's a very big question, but I think that it's
Mhm.
something that we're struggling with as a society.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing struggle, right? And that's why I say this is all process. Um, I think I have family members who you know maybe agree with me on economic issues, but disagree with me on things like abortion and so on. And one of the struggles is, okay, so how do I reconcile that? How do I so and part of it is I can't change everybody. That's why I say empathy is not absolution. But I can still love my family member who takes that position, and try to find where, areas of commonality. And I have family members I don't talk to anymore. So,
It
it
happens, yeah.
really depends. And so I wish that, I see a lot of people, but on both left and right, who, I mean, look at what's happening with the whole Epstein issue on the right,
Yeah,
so, there's people who will have very strong positions on one thing, and, the same with the abortion issue, right? And that's the only thing they want to focus in on, and everything else is like, we don't care. And that's really really hard to deal with, because people are being hurt because of the way people feel about one issue. And so one of the things I emphasize is that, it's about like education. It's about, but the problem is, we have to be very careful not to be too paternalistic. I hate that term, but we don't want to come at people, because yeah, I think about a classroom situation where I was, I had my senior seminar, and there was one kid who had a particular position that I was like a little uneasy about, but then he wrote his final paper and I was like, yeah, he really got it, he understands. I don't necessarily agree with him 100%, but he wrote a really great paper with evidence, and so I can accept that, maybe his take on this for his community and where he's coming from is a good one. And I don't like to use value judgments like it, but he did a really, um, intelligent approach to the issue, and that I can handle. It's when people take positions that don't have any basis in fact, that I have a hard time.
yeah. I had a student who we in my economics class took issue and seemingly, I think because of the content he was consuming, put the blame on a lot of our economic issues on immigrants, and he comes from an immigrant family. And I basically was saying to him, I'm like, there are ways that we can talk about immigration, we can be critical of immigration without blaming the human being who is coming here for a better future. We can say that we can't bring them in because we can't sustain it, and that is a
Mhm.
conversation we can have, like, empathetically. But
Mhm.
and by the end of the course, he was much better at articulating his point, where it's like, yes, like, it is harmful to these people to bring them in when we cannot sustain the infrastructure that they need to have a good life in Canada, and it only causes harm to multiple people. I'm like, there you go. Like, there are ways to have these conversations, to have these debates without it devolving into harmful and hurtful rhetoric. Do I still agree with the points he was making? No,
Mhm.
but he was able to do it with some research, with some understanding, and without harming people. And so that is at least the place that I see in the classroom is like, to me, that's a success, right?
Mhm.
This boy might still not politically align with the things that the values that I have, but that's not what I'm there to do. I'm there to make sure that he goes out into the world and he's not being harmful and he's being productive. And so even if we're creating allies in people who don't agree with us, we're making it so that they're not causing future harm. And so that to me is what I kind of see. Is that something that you kind of see as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, my role in the classroom, I don't hide my, first thing I said last fall is, or actually, sorry, in January when I started teaching, was I voted for Kamala Harris, and because I want my students, I don't want them guessing,
Cards on the table, yeah.
right? But my job is to teach you factually, and I mean, look, this is the thing that bothers me too, is people say, "Oh, I'm an unbiased researcher," and my book, Roots of Racism, gets into this issue with political science because. I'm sorry, just like with everything else, we bring who we are into the
Everyone's biased. We
classroom.
all got biases.
Yeah, and so that's the reason why political science took, forever to start actually even studying issues of racism. And I mean, in the 1990s, I was one of the first political scientists in the US to study comparative immigration, right? I mean, that's crazy. Immigration is one of the most politicized issues, in the world. But because of the fact that most of the people doing research were white males up to that point, it's like, oh, yeah, I'm not gonna, and there weren't very many, even though some of them, all of them came from immigrant backgrounds, it wasn't something they wanted to study. And as we got more first generation, and immigrants into academe, we started to study these things more. And so I think it's really important to understand that we bring ourselves into the classroom. Our students are going to, I don't want my students to be guessing. I want them to know where I stand on things, where it matters. Like, I'm not going to sit there and spew everything about
Every
myself.
single,
But
yeah, okay, let's go over all of
yeah,
my biases, all the things that I like and don't
yes,
like, and let
yes.
um
Although I do give them the opportunity to read Radical Empathy.
fair enough. That being said, I really do appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. If you wanted to take a moment, do you want to remind people of your books and
Sure.
where they might be able to best see more of your material?
Yeah, so actually, Radical Empathy and Roots of Racism are available anywhere you can buy books, and Amazon, and actually my publisher is Bristol University Press. And if you go to my website, you can get a discount on Radical Empathy, and then also Roots of Racism has a link there. And then Reckoning is my new book, which is coming out October 21st. I'll be doing a launch in Montreal, and
And
if
I
you're
appreciate you
interested.
giving me the opportunity to preview it. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, and if you are interested in, if anybody out there is interested in having me do a book talk or signing or anything, my website is terrigivens.com, and you can get a pre-order discount if you go to my website and get the code. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can find it there as well. So, and you can reach out to me directly.
Thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your summer.
Yep, you too. Take care.